Good evening and welcome to the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations, and welcome to anyone who's joining us online or listening to our talk recorded. It's a great pleasure to welcome here tonight Annabel Collinet, who will speak on sculptures from the medieval and modern Iranian world. Annabelle is a researcher at the Louvre, and she completed her PhD on the material culture of Sind, and has since then moved west to talk about Khorasan and its material culture tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So good evening, everyone, and dear colleagues and students. First of all, I would like to thank the Institute for the Study of Muslim Civilizations for this very kind invitation, and especially my colleague Stéphane Pradine, and Dawn Barnes and Alexandra Khan for their support in organization and flyers. So, a few words to begin with some very, very general aspects on sculpture. A sculpture can be molded, it can be cast, carved, created by modeling. The modeling can be the first step of a sculpture creation, as for the making of molds, or its final step. A sculpture can be in the round, down to low relief. It can be very tall or small. It can be plain or hollow. It can be an object or a statue, a part of architecture, be in private or in public spaces. Figurative sculpture, as we will broadly see, can figure an animal, a fantastic creator, or a human being. A sculpture can be easy to read, or quite easy to read, for instance, as an object used to pour a liquid or an incense burner. It also can be a representation of something, or even a sign of something that we have to try to decipher. Of course, both aspects can exist in the same sculpture. Figurative sculpture is, as painting, a long story debate in the Islamic world. It has been considered very variously, depending on the space and time. Some hadith, dealing with the subject of representing some living beings, animals or humans, tell about the fact that one cannot do something that casts a shadow. But there is a clear distinction between a handmade sculpture and the creation of life, as we see in Quran, where Isa or Jesus shapes a bird from clay. Besides, it was the idol and not a statue that was ordered to be destroyed to follow the order of the Prophet to Ali. What is forbidden, clearly, is idolatry, thus the worshipping of idols and their making. There seems to have two main periods for sculpture in the Islamic period Iranian world. The first great period of sculpture, and probably the main one, occurs between the 11th and 12th century AD. It took place in the context of dramatic development of the figure in 2 or 3 dimensions, and of the color also. The areas of known provenance for statues and objects that we will see are mainly situated in historical Khorasan, that is to say broadly between Afghanistan and eastern Iran, and in the central part of Iran between Rai and Kashan, Rai being a site just at the south of Tehran, and nowadays Tehran is on Rai, quite. We know plenty of figurative scenes inlaid and painted on metalware and ceramics, molded and carved in metal and ceramics as well, but also in stucco. For the medieval period, it disappeared apparently during the Mongol period in the Iranian world. The second important period is linked to zoomorphic sculptures of steel produced in Iran since the late Qajar period, so from circa 1850 forward, and which are still made today. For this period, we will see mainly some objects and contexts from Tehran and Isfahan. The relation between the medieval elite society and visual culture can be understood through some sources which are linked to mental images as poetry. They, with some historical sources, show that the conditions can, or possibilities of condition of possibilities, for this visual culture were gathered in medieval Khorasan between Eastern Iran and Afghanistan. In the 11th-12th centuries AD, lyric poetry from Ghaznavid and later Seljuk court in Afghanistan, as a panegyric qasida, offers pictures of palaces complexes, which descriptions translate their symbolic status as microcosm and cosmos. Symbolic and visual metaphors of a paradise on earth are common in medieval lyric poetry for the description of palaces and, as shown by Juliet Meysami and Ali Ashgar Seyed Gohrab, for the description of pictures representing the palaces and not the real palaces. Thus, in the poems are used representations, figurations of the described subject, which is itself an image. The lyric poetry thus shows that during the medieval period, the representation as visualization of the mental image is used as a literary topos. The poetic description, or vasf in Persian, regarding palaces uses poetic images and quotes images of magic trees with woman fruits, lions, elephants, cattle, birds as peacocks, pheasants, falcons, but also wall paintings, and the word is tasavir, but also paintings of calligraphies of Basm or Rasm, the banquet and the battle, with music players, servants bearing cups, statues in frieze, carved relief, garden pavilions, precious substances as musk and amber, etc. All these beings, subjects, and things of the poems are found in sculptures, which are preserved and were a part of this literary and visual culture. This is a world of still life, we may say, or figures forever fixed in idleness and calm, as written by the poets describing palace pictures and sometimes sculptures, that we glimpse and guess with the preserved objects. Regarding life-size or quite life-size culture, some sources give information for the Ghaznavid context in Afghanistan. In the first half of the 11th century AD, the historian Bayaki, and here I quote, obviously, both words, reports a celebration which took place in 1038 AD. He writes that on columns, 4 bronze human statues with raised arms to hold the crown were attached to the Sultan's Masud throne. In the Afghanistan North Indian context, at the same period and before, metal and stone sculptures are well known and the techniques of foundry and cutting are common. But sculptures in high relief and in the realm preserved, coming from palatial context, are mainly in stucco, gachbori in Farsi. It is a lime gypsum-based material mixed with additives to be workable. They come from Khorasan. Some heads of statues or reliefs were recently discovered in northeastern Iran, but the most famous come from Rai, near Tehran, or reportedly from Rai, as this Louvre head of prince that you have on the screen. The largest panel known in high relief is the one in the Penn Museum, published by Pope, and it is really coming from Rai, maybe the only one really coming from Rai. authenticated recently by Renata Orlode and her team. It represents, as the inscription says, the Seljuk Sultan Tugrul III, so in the late 12th century. Here the sculpture is a picture, a representation of the court system and protocol, made to be in the places of government. In the representation are also identifiable other officials as the cupbearer or dinner goblet, which is also described in sources as protocol poetry or handbooks of the 11th century from Iran to Central Asia. The personal guard of the ruler and his officials are also known in life-size sculptures, partly in high relief and partly in the round. They are the subject of the 9 sculptures numbered by Melanie Gibson, and that she interpreted as the ruler's personal guard of honor, Ghulamani Khatigi, or his vizier, or emirs. The statues, presumably or reportedly, come from Rai. They all have flat backs and were made to be against the wall. They were molded and the details were carved. This practice of finishing the molded piece with carving is found in the art of fire at the same period, especially regarding the ceramic and metal productions. The statues are polychrome, with painted and sometimes golden parts. But many of the statues passed by the art market in the early 20th century and are more or less covered with modern layers of painting and gold. These life-size sculptures were along the walls of the throne room. The stucco and painted guards were other prisons, the room being empty of real guards or not. This guard also existed in mural painting. The most ancient known is the 11th century AD representation of soldiers, constituting the famous large frieze of guards armed with maces, painted in the Lashkari Bazar Ghaznavid Palace in Afghanistan. As already mentioned, many fragments of sculptures, which are many heads, are also preserved. The highest statue known, its preserved height is almost 1.5 meters, is the one in the Met that you have on screen, with part of the legs and foot missing, and you can see it on the right. Contemporary to the large stucco sculptures are known models of architectures and statuettes in ceramic and metal, which form the corpus of the art of fire medieval sculptures. Much more are known than statues, and they form a heterogeneous and fascinating group, for which we ignore, for most of them, the provenances in terms of archaeological context, unfortunately. From the very early 11th century onwards, a dramatic change occurred in the art of ceramic with the development of fritware, a very white, thin and hard material, mainly composed of siliceous components with a small part of clay. This fabric is often molded. Molds in several parts and modeling are used to create tablewares, but also statuettes and architectural models. The different parts of the object sculptures were joined together with slip before firing. The material and artistic culture of the pre-Mongol Iranian world is also characterized, especially in Khorasan, by a great development of metalware and objects, which are like the ceramic, often molded from a model. As in ceramic, polychrome decoration is wanted, and the development of inlays on the copper alloys changes the aspect and the status of the objects that become luxury supports for surface drawings and even paintings, we may say. According to Margaret Graves, following Richard Ettinghausen, the types of hexagonal stands, as the ones that you can see here, are architectural replicas of pavilions that may have been elements of miniature gardens inside mansions, especially during winter. They are designed as architectures and may well have been part of three-dimensional pictures, representations of palace complexes. This type of khunja, or little table, as identified in the Geniza documents by Margaret Graves, may also have been used for food and drink and the display of fine vessels. These pavilion models are also known in the Syrian area before the mid-13th century AD. They usually measure between 30 to 40 centimeters height and 24 to 35 centimeters in diameter, so they are quite important objects. They are made with molded pieces of fruitware joined at the edges, according also to Margaret Graves' observations. The pavilions are generally covered with monochrome turquoise blue glaze, as the one shown here from the Tehran and New York museums. More rarely, they are more luxurious and adorned in luster, one of the most complicated surface decoration that employed metallic oxides and for which one more firing is needed. So it's very luxurious production. Their feet are sometimes with feline heads, as you can see on the pavilion in Tehran Museum. It is a common feature that is also encountered in Khorasan metalware of the same period. We also know inhabited pavilion and house models for which a material function is less obvious. Here the figures are modeled. They are part of the architectural model and are not the main subject of the sculpture here. The inhabited pavilion preserved in Tehran that you can see on the left is a very rare object type. Most common are the smallest rectangular or hexagonal objects representing house courts or rooftops, where groups of people are gathering around a meal, drink, and play instruments. Their dimensions are more or less 16 centimeters length and 5 centimeters high, so it's much smaller than the stands. Only one known object of that kind, like this on the right, presents a lion in the round and occupying all the space of the patio or rooftop. Most are made of molded fruitware, and like the stands, they are covered with turquoise or cobalt blue glaze or underglaze painted. Luster is rare on those objects. It has been suggested that they could have been gifts for a festival as Nowruz, the New Year's Day, if you want, in Persia, and more generally, good luck gifts that could be made for weddings. The house models were studied by a few scholars, very few scholars indeed. Recently by Margaret Graves. She quoted Al-Ghazali, who in the late 11th century wrote that models of animals made for children during the religious festivals should be broken. So the debate with sculpture can be concerned here, but this source also suggests a relation between models of animals and religious festivals. The glazed ceramic sculptures which were produced in the Iranian world, as in Syria, like the pavilions, at the same period and that disappeared during the 13th century AD, are small to quite imposing. They measure between 15 and 40 centimeters height. They are often painted in luster and datable circa 1150 to 75, according to Melody Gibson here. The sculptures are male and female figures, animals, birds, and mythical beings. They can have a vessel use, as ewers and vases. Some are closed and empty sculptures. The ceramic statuettes are often linked with the feast and hunting, very famous theme, that is basme or rasme. They represent three dimensions, a theme that is indeed a topos in literature and objects iconography, as on ceramic and metal. Some are containers and used to pour milk or breast milk, as suggested always by Melanie Gibson, for the opened ceramic sculptures representing a woman suckling a child, like you can see here. Mainly in Iran are preserved quite large sculptures representing animals, as this tall lion in Tehran. Oh, thank you, Melanie. So I brought a lot of pictures from this museum, which is the Museum of Ceramic and Glass in Tehran, because their collection is not well published. And they have a quite impressive collection of ceramic sculptures. Well, other common animal figures are the bull, which is the most represented with the lion. But also we have camels, elephants, monkeys, sheep, goats, birds of prey, cockerels, pigeons, hoopoes, peacocks, sphinx, harpies, etc. Animals that we all find in medieval lyric poetry and its visual paintings of palaces that I mentioned earlier. These animals are, for the most of them, mythological and astrological symbols, which well corresponds to the description of palace paintings and of palaces, which themselves are a symbolic cosmography. The relation between some objects and the literary and dictionary sources is well established, since it was explored especially by Suran Merikian-Shirvani, especially for objects linked with wine rituals. Lexicographical references define an object as a tarhuk to designate an animal-shaped vessel in the form of a bull or a lion made of gold, silver, or clay. Thanks to these sources, Melikian-Shirvani linked bull or lion-shaped vessels with wine-drinking ritual in some peculiar circumstances, as the dawning of the new year. As in metal, they disappear during the Mongol period. Other animals, and especially cocks and other birds, are linked to wine, and many bird-shaped vessels in ceramic or metal ware can be considered as wine vessels. Also dealing with wine, the poet Manushir wrote in the first half of the 11th century at Masud's court in Ghazna in Afghanistan. According to Annabelle, we studied this kind of poetry of Manushir. As many other poetry written in the same period, his poems are linked with the very important and celebrated festival of Meregan, that is the beginning of autumn, which is time of the grape harvest and pressing. On the Louvre, cockhead and tail wine that you have on the screen, generally described with the wak-wak iconography. We may indeed find a representation of Manushir creation of wine story, which knew several variants and versions in medieval Khorasan. The story is the following one. The making of the wine is a sacrifice from the vine, pregnant of sun and moon, or Gabriel, but she is a virgin, giving birth to round children that the farmer kills. These children are the daughters of the wine, the grapes, which are like dark-skinned women with bellies like perfume bottles, And on this ewer, we see this iconography of dark-skinned women, more or less round. They lay, so the grapes, they lay, the daughters, lay enclosed in a vessel for 6 months, and then there is wine. The Persian inscription on the ewer, unfortunately, does not refer to this peculiar story. It was identified by our colleague Abdullah Houshani, and who identified it as a poem of wishes, also found on many other objects of the early 13th century AD. The wine vessels also exist in metal, but many less are known compared to ceramic wine birds. This goose was made with openings on its back, probably to fill it and hold it with a lost handle. This other imposing sculpture vessel is like the previous one, a molded copper alloy, but its eyes are inlaid with copper. As a goose, there are holes on its back, suggesting a lost handle, which must have been allowed to fill the wine bird. This much smallest object may have been a wine bird, but the way it was cast with a hole in the base, as you can see on the X-ray on the left of the screen, and its legs that have to be fixed to a support, for it does not stand alone, makes this interpretation unsatisfactory. It is not easy to fill and pour wine from with this small patronage, so maybe we can think that it was an element of a larger sculpture, that is to say, an automaton. We know that automaton existed at this period also. Other animal sculptures are known from medieval Iran and especially Khorasan. They have open work bodies and were incense burners. The poetic description, or Vasf, in the 11th-12th century AD uses poetic images quoting substances and precious substances as amber, which was ambar, Tibet musk, and also sandalwood, etc., for materials and colors. So these substances were used to describe materials and colors in palaces, or more precisely, as we already saw, in pictures of palaces. Amber, musk, and sandalwood were burnt and used, along with camphor and ambergris, in several contexts as medicinal and medical uses, as rite de passage, as we would say, from birth to death. For instance, incense burners were prepared for women deliveries. In some medieval sources, some sculptures are seen with talismanic functions. The medical properties of the burned substances, as ambergris or camphor, can also be linked to this function of protection. This function is also visually associated with the objects shaped in auspicious animals. The most numerous known zoomorphic incense burners, several dozens are kept, are felines, or more precisely lynx or caracals, which are species of lynx. Not two of them are the same. Thus, the existence of moles is not obvious. The largest known is kept in the Met, this is this one, and is 85 centimeters height. This is, I think, the tallest metal sculpture kept for this period. It was found in Iran, in the site of Taibad in eastern Khorasan, and is signed by Jafar ibn Muhammad ibn Ali, and dated in the late 12th century. The others incense burners in feline shapes are around 30 centimeters height. And this one is in the Louvre. It is inlaid not with metal, but with a cut shard of turquoise blue glazed fruitware. Here is the X-ray. This feline was made in 2 parts and no seam line is visible. Direct casting of the wax model may be an idea for its making. And I also put here slide of the eyes, of the blue eyes inlaid in the holes kept for the insert of the eyes on this sculpture. Turquoise blue, which here is made with copper oxide on the fruitware, on the fruit fabric, is as auspicious as the precious substances and the zoomorphic model of the sculpture. The most famous turquoise mines were in Nishapur, in Iranian Khorasan. This falcon incense burner, a bird of prey, which is, well, probably a falcon, is much less common as a shape, and only a few examples are known. This one is in the Louvre in Paris, has its tail broken and thus lost its balance. It cannot stand alone in reality, but it can on the picture, as you see here. Its surface is covered with chase design, and it is also inlaid with a turquoise blue glazed fruitware shard. We see that the eyes are empty on the X-ray. As the X-ray shows, and as observed on the feline, it is made in 2 parts. The legs are plain, and the eyes were made hollow to be inlaid. And another time, no seam line can be seen. It may have been done in 2 parts, cast in direct wax process after the cutting of a closed model of wax. This is the hypothesis that David Bourgarit, my archaeometallurgist colleague, and I had for the making of this very peculiar sculpture. Let's now split to other zoomorphic and much later sculptures, leaving the palatial and elite medieval society context for the Shiite devotional practices. Sorry for my bad accent. The numerous sculptures of steel with gold and silver overlays preserved in public and private collections in Europe, USA, and Iran are among the most appreciated objects of the Qajar period in the 19th century, broadly. These birds and animal-shaped sculptures are quite tall because they can measure between 15 to 80 centimeters height. The animals represented are peonies, doves, ducks, and gooses, birds of prey, but also deers, as you can see on the screen, for example, felines, cats, elephants, camels, lambs, and Al-Buraq, who was the celestial mounting of the prophet. Today, often isolated, the sculptures were made to be presented by pairs, as shown, for instance, by several exemplaries in French public collections, as the deers from the Museum of Fine Art in Rennes that you have here on the screen, and which was never published. There are polychrome works of grey color with a dark brown patina, with thin ornaments in silver and gold. These sculptures do not form a homogeneous group. Some present very simplified reliefs, others are more realistic in the represented spaces. The surface decorations generally mix chasing and precious metal overlays. So they draw figurative, calligraphic, and vegetal ornaments, which are sometimes at the junctions areas of the different parts and hide these junctions. More rarely, inlays of precious or semi-precious stones give color to the surface and are also used for the eyes. Other objects also in steel with gold and silver overlays represent some fruits as pears, grenades, apples, and guavas with quite realistic dimensions. Some of the zoomorphic sculptures bear traces of soldering under the legs, showing that they were fixed on supports. Others, like lambs and fruits, are made with a hole on the base, which allowed to put them on a vertical stick. This is the case for this object here on the left. In the Museum of Fine Arts in Europe, the devotional context of this sculpture is very rarely explained, and they are often described as mainly decorative objects. The European collectors bought them as decorative objects, as illustrated by some 19th century pictures of English mansions. Purchased in Iran as soon as this period, and certainly a short time after the production, the Qajar sculptures of European collections were sometimes reproduced without mention of their use in the 19th century proper. In Qajar Iran, steel sculptures could also have been used as decorative. For example, the cats seem to be decorative sculptures. In any case, they were not linked to devotional practices. Lions were associated with the image of the Shah in the throne, emblem of Iran, posing with a lion, who is Ali, and the sun. On the screen, you can see a lion on the back of the throne of Muzaffar Ali Shah Qajar, who reigned until the early 20th century. But the main use of the steel sculptures is the alam, literally sign. The alam is a devotional standard used during the Muharram processions commemorating the martyrdom of Hussein. The standards were linked to military equipment and then mainly associated with the religious processions. They are more or less complex, the simplest being a vertical, like a stick, with one final. The horizontal alams, measuring several meters long and with animal and bird-shaped sculptures, probably developed in Iran from the mid-19th century onward, following the very important growth of Muharram ceremonies promoted by Fath Ali Shah, who reigned until 1834. The support following a symmetrical composition, vertical, round, or tear-shaped epigraphic standards bearing the names of Muhammad and the Shia imams. Around are arranged by pairs, the sculptures, but also arms and armor elements besides fruits and vases. So this is the picture of 1909 with the horizontal alam, where you see the sculpture on the upper part. The sculptures of sometimes quite small dimensions are thus parts of much more important assemblage or assembly that can be as large as a street. The monumental alams open the funerary procession and they are the most visible and imposing supports of Muharram ceremonies. They possess the symbolic function of representing Hussein and his martyrdom, the Karbala martyrs, and the other holy figures, like, obviously, Muhammad, Ali, and the Shia imams. The huge devotional supports are taken outside for the 10th day, that is Ashura, of the month of Muharram, when is commemorated the sacrifice of Hussein. Lambs sacrificed during the commemorations can be part of the alam sculptures. The sculptures and objects, I forgot to show you this maybe, as long as a street. Impressive. The sculptures and objects of the monumental alams are the figurations, the visual images of the Passion of Hussein in Karbala, and the symbolic representations of imams or linked to the imams. The deer, for example, refers to Imam Reza, the peony to the Mahdi, and Ali is, of course, a lion of God. These allegories are evocations of the names and moral qualities of the 12 imams. Their meaning nowadays can also be associated to Suleiman, master of the creators. During Muharram are made some gifts of food to the Karbala martyrs. The votive practices, nasr, of fruits are also recalled by their representations on the alams. Here you have another example of the center of one large alam. This one was in Qom, I think. And here you see well the different sculptures, the lions, and especially the peonies around. And this is a very interesting picture where you see some part of one monumental alam with the sculptures, but also with helmets here and the doll in the center. On this picture showing, we see women putting ribbons on the alam because those monumental sculptures are also ex-voto circles. Mirrors, feathers, textiles, and ribbons are put or tied on the standards. On these alams, the signs, the assembled representations are thus polysemous. They work as an intercession to the spiritual and are the catalyst of a vision, a visualization process which, through the objects, shape a symbolic and intermediary world, as told by Christian Gruber. These signs serve a votive theatricality that recalls the taziyeh, the votive theater in Iran, and the nakali, which is also a narrative cycle of the drama of Karbala. So narrative and symbolic cycles linked with the Karbala battle that developed at the same period that the monumental alams. On the alams, we see some accessories like arms and helmets that I've shown you earlier, similar to the ones used in the Tadziyeh theater. In addition, during the second half of the 19th century, processions following the Tadziyeh, as the Okabas, took place with alams of that type. Again, alam as an ex-voto. Whatever their purpose, purchased or made as ornamental sculptures or related to Shiite devotion, all the sculptures made in wrought and overlaid steel seem to have been produced in the same workshops, which mainly supply the alams. The two sculptures preserved in the British Museum and which are signed by Haji Abbas, who have lived between 1865 and 1960, and which are inlaid with garnet or ruby and turquoise, seems well to be major clues of a production that can be used for ornamental purpose, but which appears to be mainly linked to the production of devotional objects. As James Allen discovered with an interview of his grandson in the early 1990s, Haji Abbas worked in Isfahan as Alamat Saz, so the one who is making the alams, in the family workshop of alams during the second half of the 19th century, because he began very, very young. He realized animal-shaped sculptures for which he was very famous. A peony signed by him is now still in the Iran-Nebastan Museum in Tehran. The inlaid and overlaid decorations were not made by him, but done by specialized craftsmen, This division of work between shape and decoration was usual for the makers of these sculptures and in general in the arts of metal. The sculptures made by Haji Abbas were made for the Muharram processions, and some of them, as a deer, were 25 years ago still kept in the chai khana, a tea house, of his neighborhood in Isfahan. So this is not that one, but one who is, I don't know why, here. Excuse me. The element used in Iran still bear some animal sculptures of the late Qajar period or their reproductions, but also other steel objects as models of mosques and small bells, as you can see on this one. The alam preserved in Paris in the Musée du Quai Branly was made in the early 20th century, and it illustrates a modernization of the chasing techniques here done with acid, sometimes employed on sculptures which were made after the 19th century AD. The monumental standard presents a pair of cocks, which in the Shi'i cosmology announces the Judgment Day in its prayers. The sculptures can be compared to the ones of the Qajar period, for the descendants of the 19th century craftsmen are working in the contemporary workshops and supply the elements and sculptures for the alams. Although steelcraft related to the devotional practices have declined a lot since the late Qajar period, sculptures of the same type were still produced at the end of the 20th century, especially in Isfahan. As published by Zento, for example, the Bahman brothers' workshop produced in Isfahan during the late 1990 alams, birds, animals, and vases. Their shapes were wrought from big steel tubes. In Tehran, the steel sculptures production still exists, but as it was told by old craftsmen, it tends to disappear. Steel, as noticed already by James Allen, may have a peculiar link with Shiism. It is often used for the making of objects linked to Shiite devotional practices and for architectural elements in the Shiite sanctuaries. During the Qajar period, iron was extracted and treated in Iran, but iron and steel were mainly imported from Russia and India as leaf, bars, pig iron, but mainly under the shape of scrap melting. Concerning the objects, we have the Isfahan Guild's documents for the years 1870 studied by Willem Floor. The role played by the guilds is central in Muharram ceremonies, in the patronage of alams, and also in their making. The big center for engraved steel was Isfahan, according to Murdoch Smith, so in the second half of the 19th century. Murdoch Smith also writes that when they were making those alams, they practiced two types of precious metal decorations on steel: the overlay of wires on a rough surface, which corresponds to our damasquinure in French, and the leaf gilding was also existing. He writes that inlay, that is to say the hammering of precious metal in chiseled surface, has disappeared at that time. But according to Benjamin in 1887, the Guild of Gold Engravers and Inlayers, the Nakashezargar, use three techniques that also concern the silver inlays. On steel, wire inlays are done, as well as damasquinure and overlays of thick gold leaf. At last, the technique of covering the steel by a thick leaf of gold was also existing. Following the observations made by Wolf in Iran before 1941, the main productions of gold inlayers were the animals sculptures with religious meaning, which are taken out for Muharram days, and Wolf published pictures of the overlaying of a deer. The alamat are the orders and possessions of different social groups who own at least one alam, as a guild, sanf, a religious organization, ayat madhabi, or a town or village district, a mahalla. The names of these communities appear on the standard. The alams are linked to the taqiyye or usaniyes, that is, places of worship for Hussein, where in each neighborhood the members of the bazaar guilds or of religious societies gather during the Muharram days and for the funerary processions. The monumental alams are taken out of their taqiyyas on the eve of Ashura, so the 10th day of Muharram. At the end of the Safavid period, the alams were kept by the guilds in the Shah Souk and by the city districts in the local bazarche, well, the house of the bazaar and their mahalla. They thus are devotional objects linked with social groups, but preserved in the bazaars or public spaces of the neighborhood, not in religious spaces. The case seen by James Allan in Isfahan in the late 20th century tells that the alams could be kept by neighborhood members. He also saw a halam in the main room of a private house in Isfahan used as a usaniyeh. Outside of Muharram, the huge halams are kept in public spaces as gymnasiums, for these very, very heavy standards are manipulated by Westlers. For example, in Qazvin, always in the end of the 20th century, have been observed by Baker the mounting of a halam belonging to the Westlers' house, or Zurkhana, who are associated to popular religious groups. Nevertheless, some alams are also kept or exhibited, it's not always clear, in religious structures. Sometimes decorative objects, but mainly elements of monumental standards linked with Muharram and Ashura. The zoomorphic sculptures of the Qajar period are signs, parts of the religious narrative, devotional supports, and exporto, associated to religious ceremonies dramatically developed during the Qajar period. They are not sanctuaries objects, but participate, especially for Ashura, to the major devotional representation in modern and contemporary Iran. I thank you for your attention and passion for my English.
Thank you very much indeed, Annabelle, for your very rich and richly illustrated talk. I've learned a very great deal. We have a few moments for questions, if any of you have any. So now's the time. Leah, will you come round with the microphone? Yeah. Okay. Shall I start? So, Annabelle, have I got the chronology right? Is there a large period where you don't have these kind of animal?
It does not, to my knowledge, no, but we have this important production in the middle period, and then it disappears, apparently, as far as we know until now, because maybe one day we will discover those things. And after we have these very different context sculptures, but what is interesting is to try to link, what we can consider as a sculpture in different contexts. In the medieval context, what does it mean? You have, a statue of a cock, and how can you interpret it with some literary, for example, sources? And you have this same cock several centuries after, and it is like a Shia symbol, or it has a significance, and the sign and the significance of the sign has nothing to do with what you could imagine. If you try to compare two same creatures, but from very different periods. So I thought it was interesting to show the difference of interpretation that we can have. And also that to say that in, not always, obviously, but in much fine arts museum, those kind of contexts are not questioned. And you can have a description or just a label as a cock or a figure. And you have somewhere the word sometimes decorative. So try to go further than decorative, because this is the we are the heir of the collectors of the 19th century, and the objects were decorative at that time in their eyes, but it's not.
So you're adding in this religious context, this other
for this period,
for the 19th
yes,
century.
Yes.
Do you have any comment on why the Mongol period causes this form of decorative art form to disappear?
Not really, but maybe the possibilities were not there anymore, because it seems that we have this very peculiar context of there is a relation with visualization of things and the representation of things that we see clearly in poetry. And after that, poetry is changing, and you do not find the same descriptions, and you do not find the same, as far as I know, mental images, and this very large, this very important thing that was representation and symbolic representation of something. It seems to be lost, and it was at a peculiar period in quite a huge area, but in a peculiar region. And maybe that after that it changed, and the possibilities were not gathered to keep the same, let's say, episteme.
That's fascinating. Thank you.
This may be a very broad question, but do you think it's possible to find other relationships between, let's say, poetry and figurative art in other? Do you have any other societies? I mean, have any?
I'm quite sure, but we have to. There are people who are working on, the history of poetry and the theory of poetry and the rule that you have to get in poetry, and they can explain us what we can find in this kind of text and others, like in historical texts But yes, I think one day we will find more. But they have to explain us, because I am not able to read it and explain it. It's not only to read and to edit a text, it's to understand with the theory of literature of a given period what it can mean.
My question follows on the first question, actually. In the Tiburit manuscript, The Paths of Paradise, there is a very curious representation of a huge cock, which some scholars tend to interpret as the survival of the cosmic cock of Zoroastrianism.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, it is interesting to know your opinion, how safe it is to look for pre-Islamic Iranian survivals in the semantics of that sort of...
Meliki and Gervani has shown that it was a very important thing to have in mind what was before the Islamic period, of course. And there is a link between the previous period and the Islamic period, obviously. But for the manuscript that you mentioned, this large cock in the elevation manuscript of Muhammad, the Mihraj Name, it also exists in the 14th century. So this image of this cosmic cock goes on, but it's a very peculiar context. it is a mirajname, and it's a later copy of that text. So maybe it explains something. You see my point.
Thank you for a very illuminating talk. At the time of Ashura, you see, I think the procession and all with that, we call it Tajia or something like that. It's something similar sort of thing. I've never particularly very closely looked at. You see, I've attended some of the ceremonies where is there something similar to that? What is the significance of Tajia?
I don't know. Tajia, you mean?
Yeah, that's where they have something like this, you see.
Yeah,
in the procession, you see.
Yes, but you mean for the theater? Yes. I've read that in sources were found some references to some processions that were made with alams at some points of the Tadiyya cycles, but nothing is shown. So we do not know if it is the simple standard or the large one. But the relation between those monumental alams in the second half of the 19th century, the Tadziyeh, which is a votive theater, and which employs some of the same helmets and arms that we see on the alams, so that we are in the same context. And also with the Nokoli, where a man is standing in front of a painting or several paintings, which represents the cycle of the martyrium of Hussein. So we are in the same context or of votive representation. But I do not know how it was built. You see my point? I do not know how these different votive theaters were built and how.
We have a question online, so Layal will read it out.
As you know, lion images also have been used by Italian Venetians. So at the same time, speaker said that it's also important for Iranian Shah figures. So is there any aspects between the two worlds?
But this is the general aspect of the lion. But I'm not sure too. Sorry. This is. What do you think? This is a general aspect of the lion.
Yes.
Thank you for your fantastic talk, Annabelle. What do you think the relationship was between ceramic figures and metal figures? Because I'm going back to the medieval period really here, that in a few cases there are relationships, but they're not nearly as many as we expect to find between them. So, for instance, when you were showing the tabouret with the foot, that is a shape that we see being represented in metal, but we don't get so many relationships between them.
The first relationship that everybody knows in Islamic art is the relation between shapes. We all know the relation between a ceramic and a metal shape. After that, the second point is how it is made. So I think that one of the interesting points is to compare how it is done. When you know that you go from a model, it can be a fabric model or for metal a wax model. And when you have this, you have two choices. For the metal, you can make a mold with the lasagna technique, for example. And when you want from the model of ceramic, you want to mold it, you do what? You do another mold on the model. So here we have something in common in the techniques of the two productions. But as you know, and as you said, sorry, the points of relations are not always easy to see, and also because every material cannot answer to what is asked. You see, did I answer your?
I think I'm right in saying that the Safavid period was a great time for importing Chinese porcelain, indeed the Mongol. Did they in fact import any zoomorphic porcelains then, or was it purely dishes and plates?
That's a very, very good question. Yeah, we know vessels, but we do not know figures. But maybe we did not look close enough. But I only know vessels.
In the big collections, though.
No.
So in the three big collections, there are no models.
No. But maybe this is a kind of subject that we should try to find in sources. What is exported? Yeah. In the period when they could import, because it was not always possible. So that's why there was a large development of copies, let's say, of ceramics made in Iran and really look like Chinese things. But it's when you have a Chinese plate, it's very, very heavy, and when you have a Persian plate, it's not so heavy. This is one of the differences. But for figures, it's a very good question, but I can't remember. I've seen one. No, then you give me an idea. Thank you.
Please.
Can I ask quite a specific question to something that you said? I just want to check I understood. You were talking, I think, about the stucco sculptures and how when they were collected in the 19th century, they had modern paint layers. Could you tell me, were those, was this a system of, they were originally polychrome figures?
Yes.
So were there layers kind of added over the years as
Yes.
we find sometimes in Western things, or were they, because often, in fact, the polychrome was stripped off by collectors.
This is not my field, so I will be very precautious on that. But what I know is that it was in context of big markets. So it's more early 20th century than late 19th century for this subject. But they were very erased, the sculptures. So most of them were, let's say, recurved, or, something was arranged on the surface because it was not, the nose was broken and everything was broken. So it is not, you cannot sell that. So there was this kind of, let's say, restoration. And it is the same for the paintings and even golding. So layers of paintings can be modern, but modern of the early 20th century. So the trouble would be to try to understand what is modern and what is not. And what do? Do we try to remove the modern one to try to see what's under, or does, do you know?
Yes.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We have time for one more question. Anyone else? Yes, please, right back.
You talked about the healing properties of the incense and of the burners, and I wondered in that medieval period whether particular animals were associated with healing properties, for instance, in your sense.
For example, lions and falcons were.
Yeah, were there particular animals chosen for
They had this significance, but also they were linked, to the chase. hunting. So they recover several significances, but for example, other auspicious animals could be sphinx, peonies, doves. They were not the only ones. And when the animals were linked, with the cosmographic and astronomical, let's say, iconography, they were auspicious. But for example, for the incense burners, the fact that they have precious medicinal substance in them, and they were in shape of auspicious animals, and also that they had these blue eyes was okay. You can be quiet. Everything will be fine. It's auspicious. Everything is auspicious.
So I'd like to thank Annabelle once again for her most illuminating talk. Thank you very much. Please do join us on Monday, the 13th of November, for our next talk, which is by the